In the volatile Middle East, regional tensions not only persist, but escalate, challenging global peace and security. Amid rising proxy conflicts and potential regional wars, the influence of Western powers wanes. The quest for stability and peace becomes increasingly urgent. This discussion explores strategic approaches to transform regional turmoil into lasting stability. We'll delve into the Middle East as a strategic chessboard, debating if it will remain a key arena where global titans play a high-stakes game, potentially redefining its role as a flashpoint in international relations.
Hi, welcome to the panel about the Middle East and what we called trying to drain the quagmire. I'm really excited to have this conversation. Coming from Middle Eastern studies, I feel like there's been a gap since yesterday until now in talking about really important issues. That is what's happening in the Middle East. So I want to invite all four of you at the beginning to start with a sort of an intellectual exercise and try to fit in the Middle East into the main topic of the ARC, which is the art of winning. So what we are asking in the conceptual note to this panel is the following. How can we define the front in the Middle East between the free world and the fight of the free world against imperialist forces and imperialist adversaries? So this is very tricky. I'm not asking about the front between Israel and Palestine. I'm not asking about the front between Israel and Iran and the sort of axis of resistance. I'm not asking about the front between the Muslims and the Jews. I'm asking about the front between the free world and the imperialist forces. Patsy, want to start?
I get to go first, yay. I guess I would frame it in the not the imperialist powers, because in another era, other countries would have been seen as the imperialist powers in the Middle East. I would frame it in the larger construct that we talked about yesterday, that it's authoritarian versus democracies, right? This convenient alliance between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea being the authoritarian at this point, informal alliance that we are we're entering into a global war against that alliance on different fronts. The Middle East front, I think right now, with what's happened since October 7th, became even more fraught in terms of how the free world and a democracy like Israel continues to represent democracy when a lot of innocents are being killed. I don't think we need to debate Israeli military strategy in this forum, but we're in danger of becoming seen by a lot of the less powerful populations around the world as the imperialist power. And that became shockingly clear yesterday when some of your team presented their Africa research. Russia is flipping the script in some of the countries of Africa and making America and the West the enemy, the imperialists, the people, or the powerful countries that are not fighting for human rights and the things that we say we stand for. So we're in a very delicate situation right now, to be continued.
Okay. If we consider this front as a front between democracies and non-democracies, authoritarianism, autocracies, dictatorships, then according to rankings, various rankings, only Israel and maybe to an extent Lebanon, maybe Bahrain would be somewhere up the ladder of democracies, but the rest of the countries are still not free. So is it really a useful differentiation when it comes to the Middle East?
Yeah, I think that's what makes it's so confusing to try to like pull apart how the West democracies, the free world that we stand for, how are we actually actualizing that in that region going forward? I think it requires a whole new approach. It requires greater partnerships around some of the rapidly changing areas of cooperation and technology, and just better providing for the citizens. And that's what we say as free governments, that we do better: greater accountability, greater protection of individual rights. There's a lot to unwind there. I don't have all the answers yet, sorry.
Sure, no, I hope we can discuss that further. John, what about you? How do you see that?
Look, I think it's one of those things where when you're talking about the Middle East, very few people really understand the region. Very few people understand the region and the complexities that go beyond the mere lines on a map. You know, we tend to look at things, try to overlay it with a simplistic filter, let the media get hold of that, and then run stories, whether or not they are even close or remote to the truth or not. It doesn't make any difference because most people don't care. You know, I think that basically what we're looking at, I agree with Patty's reframing of the situation. I think that there is certainly a sense of autocracies versus democracies, but it's more complex than that, because some of those autocracies are tied to Western interests. So we have to play nice with some. We don't have to play nice with others. Again, it's a complicated situation, and many people won't really understand that. They will want to see it as, okay, say for instance, Israel is the only democracy, and so therefore the only country and group of people worthy of consideration of defense of their interests. Now, there is a strong case to be said about that, but that also means that those people who are trapped in autocratic states who probably deserve political freedom at some point are being ignored completely, because, of course, our strategy is premised on the primacy of Israeli survival at the expense of Arab liberation. And when I'm saying liberation, I'm actually talking about liberation from autocratic rule.
Right. Omar?
Thank you. Well, I'll give you three ways of framing it. One way is, as you said, authoritarian versus democracy. And the problem with that, as was mentioned, most of the regime types there are non-democratic, although the Freedom House, I think, recent classification classified Jordan and Morocco as semi-free, but the rest are problematic. And the pro-democracy forces that attempted to change these regimes failed to do so, and they are suffering now from a similar situation that the Russian opposition suffers from: decentralized, weak, and underfunded, and unorganized, lack of leadership, and so on and so forth. So the change is not near in that way. The problem is if you decide to form a front with authoritarian allies, they're not very reliable. And as you saw, some of those allies were facilitating funds, gold, resources, ammunition, like the 122 millimeters artillery shells, to the Russian Federation, until they get exposed by U.S. intelligence and so on, and then things change a bit. And this is by countries, some of which were funded, trained, and financed. Their armies were funded and trained and financed and equipped by the U.S. So not very reliable in that aspect. So this is one problem. The other way to frame it is, as you mentioned, imperial versus independent. But for that, the West need to reframe the strategic communications in a very different way, because you had Russian imperialism in Syria. Aleppo in many ways was a prelude to Mariupol. You had as well Iranian sort of imperialism, but it's a very interesting and subtle way of using sub-state actors, armed non-state actors, to build up military potential and have a veto in high politics in the security and the defense affairs of capitals. So arguably Beirut and Sana'a are in the hands of, I don't like the term proxies, because it oversimplifies the type of relationship of these actors have with Iran. But Beirut and Sana'a, we would say, very high influence for Iranian sub-state allies. Baghdad and Damascus are on the same route. So here are four capitals controlled by shall we say, sub-state actors or influenced by sub-state actors that are very close to Iran without Iranian boots on the ground. And they're not even governments, so they're not even accountable to electricity, welfare, what have you. But they have their own vetoes. So that's another way to frame it, that subtle postmodern sub-state imperialism in a different way, a hybrid in many ways. And of course, Russia took some notes, starting from the LNR and the DNR pre-2022, and the Wagner Group afterwards. And there was an excellent report by PISM that was outlined yesterday, PISM. And add to that, a third way of doing it, and also a third way of framing it, is small state versus big state, or smaller state versus bigger state, because many of these states, especially in the Gulf region, were attacked at one point or another, were almost either invaded like Kuwait or almost invaded like Qatar, and they see what's happening in Ukraine, the second largest country in Europe, with over 50 countries backing it as a friends of Ukraine in the Rammstein group, and watching that if Ukraine loses conventionally, so what would happen to us versus when they face Iran and with all these allies. So I think that there's a lot of ways to frame it, but most of them are maybe problematic. And I totally agree with John here. It's a very complex region. I lived there since 2018. I thought I'm a Middle East expert until I lived there. And then I realized I don't know much about that region. I need to learn more.
Yeah, thanks for problematizing that. I think it's very useful, the three ways of looking at it. General Andrzejczak, Raimund, if I may, just for the sake of consistency.
Call me White Eagle 6.
So the Polish view on that, how do you see those front lines?
You know, the vocabulary matters because we have a lot of challenges to use the proper words. And if you say imperial states, I have a challenge, who is imperial right now? However, in a strategy, historical context matters. So the Persian Empire or Ottoman Empire, we still see some, dynamics and some energizers as well. So maybe you're right. But I would prefer to use the terms autocratic countries and democracy for sure. It looks like we have a choice between bad and very, very bad. So if I see in performance of Israel right now, especially looking in the screen a few seconds ago, most of them are about emotions. It's extremely difficult for us to describe Israel today as a definition of democracy. That's the biggest challenge. That we should focus on definition of democracy and performance of Israel, especially here in Poland when we hear comments of Ambassador Livna, who commented one of the Polish volunteers being killed in Gaza. No empathy, and again, back to the emotions we see. So for sure, there was not a democratic example. And in the other side, we have Hezbollah, we have Hamas, we have Iran with all of the aspirations. So it looks like, from me today, that Israel is a consumer of the values of democracy, but not necessarily someone who is building democracy. So vocabulary matters. So we have to, synchronize and calibrate the terms we use, and this is huge challenge, especially here in Warsaw.
Yeah, I really like how you put it, because to me, I think the characteristic of the free world is that we abide by the law. And there is international law. In a couple of hours at 3 p.m., the International Court of Justice will again deliver its decision on Israeli conduct in Gaza. And so if we shudder at Russia's conduct in Ukraine, thrashing international law to pieces, we should also be vocal if Israel does the same and if the court decides about it that way. Do you have an opinion about it? Yeah, go ahead, John.
Look, I think that this is a real point of controversy here. I know that people feel rather offended by having Prime Minister Netanyahu as an equivalent of the Hamas leadership. You know, one is a democratic elected leader, the other one, the other group, I should say, is representing a terrorist organization and a non-state actor. But the fact of the matter is that in this war there are two contestants. And failing the fact that Hamas is actually a political group as well as a militia, it is representing that group in Palestine, in Gaza, from a political perspective, as well as leading what it considers a resistance to Israeli oppression. We may not like to hear this. We may think this is all rubbish, but in the end, this is also a truth that some people in Gaza will fight and die for, which makes things very difficult. And I would go one step further. When we talk about divisions in the Middle East, it's been mentioned about the axis of resistance. I don't think it's much of an axis of resistance as much as it is an axis of revenge. Because really, what is this axis fighting for? What is the end point? You know, since yesterday, we've been talking about high strategy, and it's so refreshing to come from Australia to a place, Poland, on the edge of, one of Europe's worst military crises in quite a few decades, and to hear the level of sophisticated thinking that is going on here. It gives me, as an Australian, a great deal of hope that we can come together. But, just looking at the title, The Art of Winning. So if we look at winning, what does that mean? What does it mean in the Middle East context? The Iranians are fighting for what exactly? They're just throwing a few missiles at Israel in the hope that maybe they score a victory. Maybe they'll kill a few Israeli citizens, and then what? What after? No one's talking about the after, right? Now, when we talk about the Ukraine war, it's a similar kind of situation where we see the war happening, and then it's all right, the war is happening. Is it a territorial war? Is it a war of wiping out Ukrainian statehood? Whatever that war happens to be, what is the thing after? And again, in the Middle East, there's just no clear answer because everyone is fighting, but there's no end point to it. Lasting peace, if it is indeed something that we want, has to take into consideration an enemy population's political, economic, and other welfare. Now, so far, the Netanyahu government hasn't really cared a lot about what's going on in Gaza. How it plays out is anyone's guess, but if it stays a military war, it's going to be a problem.
Right. Unless any of you want to jump in on the international law question specifically.
just if I may, a few
right.
words. I'm totally agree. The strategy is about something which is on the other side of the hill. We don't see. And emotions are exactly, we're driven every day by media. So if we see, let's say, option one and support what Israel is doing, which is controversial because still we're given, legitimates to Netanyahu, which is bad, and then we accept the civilians being killed every day, and then option two is Hamas winning, Iran winning, a nuclear possession, and consuming more and more resources that we need for Ukraine, not necessarily for Middle East. Is the question for us. So the strategy is to see what is in the other side of the hill. And the other side, only two scenarios, bad and very, very, very bad. That's the option today.
Right. Well, the 90s in the Middle East were not that bad, okay? We can think of a time in the Middle East when things were not as bad, okay? And that really got bad after 2001 and the 9/11 and the wars in the Middle East by the US, which brings me, Patty, to you. So I'm wondering now, let's get more concrete and finish with our intellectual exercises. So the U.S. Politics and U.S. Policy vis-a-vis Israel specifically, is it changing? Because, on the one hand, you can look at it in the following way. Biden has taken out this atomic option of stopping deliveries of several thousands of bombs to Israel because of its conduct in Gaza. There are protests on U.S. campuses. There's a push at least from part of Democrats, to change this policy. But on the other hand, Biden himself, he represents this sort of older generational thinking about Israel, and more is still the same. With his other hand, he signs new contracts and deliveries continue. So are we in a sort of a seminal moment in U.S. politics when it comes to Israel, or there'll be more and more of the same?
I think you almost answered the question with your great comments there, because President Biden is really threading a needle, right? I have some daughters that are late 20s and early 30s, and their peer group is up in arms for the Gazans, and they don't have the historical context or the real understanding of the long U.S. alliance with Israel. So I think President Biden is really trying to nuance as much as possible, and I think Secretary of State Blinken is going all out for how do we resolve this, how do we stop the killing of civilians, and I think they're messaging pretty strongly on that. But this goes to my earlier point that there's so much at stake right now with the perceptions of whether we free societies are all talk and are not really protecting innocent civilians wherever they may be, or if it's just a power game for us and we're beholden to Israel completely. So I would say that the administration is doing its best to walk that line, but it plays into the larger global war, and this is part of the alliance of convenience where it's helping Putin that Iran is not just instigating some of these, the Houthis and Hamas and Hezbollah to continue to create conflict, to continue to hit from different flanks. So I think, I guess I would summarize it by saying that we have to see the whole battle space, and that pulls into full spectrum Russian hybrid warfare with Ukraine as the central front, but all these other conflicts and percolating perceptions of who are the good guys and who are the bad guys here. So we've got a lot of work to do.
Right, but could you unpack it a bit further? So the Democrats is one camp, and what about Republicans and the coming elections in the U.S.? How will this issue play in the elections, and what can change after the elections? Let's presume for a second that Trump wins.
I can't, well, that's hard for me to presume, but I personally, but I think Trump has, when I've heard him speak to this, he's doubled down on the Israeli side. So in terms of the domestic politics and the younger generation being up in arms and sharing on social media about how terrible it is, Trump is much further to the Israeli side and much less balanced in the rhetoric that I've heard out of him. So politically, I don't think that plays for the Republicans.
Okay. Raimund, looking at the panel, it just struck me this morning that probably us as Poles will be the closest to the region of conflict, because Patty's coming from the US, John's coming from Australia, and I understand, Omar, you're a British Canadian. So us Poles, we are the closest to the conflict, and Polish policy vis-a-vis the Middle East does matter. So is anything changing because of the...
It matters.
Yes. Is anything changing because of the war in Gaza in terms of how we structure or should structure our policy towards Israel, Palestine, Iran, the broader region, within the EU and EU attitude towards the region?
You know, this is a time exactly when Poland was elevated a little bit in the table, and we're playing slightly different game, not necessarily locally oriented, but we are champion. So the relations between the global issues are more and more important. And from my perspective, of course, Poland Poland first. This is no questions about it. For me, as someone who is Polish, who is officer, patriot, it's Poland first. However, we have to understand the dynamics, and we have 3 fronts right now, globally. Number one is a challenge called China. And this is a Taiwan and entire region that you, from Australian perspective, knows very well. And this is cold. This is passive. And then we have a front in the Middle East, which is Israel and Gaza, but not only, Iran and all of those dynamics. And this is hot. This is active. And the last one is Ukraine. So from my perspective, I realize a lot of discussions, especially in Brussels, from NATO perspective, which is always our priority. China, Taiwan is no NATO issue, so we shouldn't care. Israel and Gaza is no NATO issue. For some of the countries, it's even opportunity. Look at the European Union countries and China. But Ukraine, it is. However, if the same security provider, the biggest and the most effective, no matter what the opinion is, which is the United States, has 3 fronts, and we have still the same resources. So ammunition, we really would like to and appreciate to send to Ukraine through the Polish logistic hub in Rzeszów-Jesionka. It goes to Israel. It consumes, resources. It is not supporting our objective. So we have to see huge, the global aspects and relations between the, Taiwan, Gaza, and Ukraine. So this is probably very new situation from Poland. I say, if anything happened in Taiwan and South Korea is really concerned, so my K2s, my tanks, my artillery, and my airplanes are not going to Poland, but they will be, frozen in the different regions. So although we don't have geostrategic aspirations, we have to understand the implications, the interlink between three, I've called it centers of gravities right now, or strategical theaters. That's the new situation from Poland. But I see the situation, and every day I'm studying really carefully what's going on in Gaza, believe me.
So that's a great analysis, but now, so what about recommendations? So what to do? Should anything change?
Well, it is interesting. As a Poland, spending 4% GDP and investing in defense sector very much, we should not be so selfish and looking and understanding only through the, Polish-Ukrainian line, but our discussion with the United States should consider as well that kind of perspective. So we should support Americans somehow, which is, sounds strange and pretty, high level, but without that kind of understanding, in the end of the day, we still have the same numbers of JASSMs, in production in U.S., delivering to the Pacific, to the Gaza, or to Poland. I prefer Poland, but it's interlinked system.
Right. So let me just share with you very briefly my experience at the United Nations, the Advisory Committee of the UN Human Rights Council. And so there are people from the so-called Global South there, also representatives, right? And they come up to me and they think of Poland as, representative of the Global North, part of the EU. There's a Brazilian, a South African, an Indian, and they say, so you come to us and preach that we need to sanction Russia because it invaded Ukraine. But what you do in Israel with Israel is this and that. So I'm telling you this just to show that in the mindsets of many people, there's a connection between the two issues, and there's a common denominator. So, as you said, if there are 3 spots in the world that are sort of flary and very conflict-ridden, and with a potential global implication, then I want to ask John, coming from Australia and the Indo-Pacific region, which is #1 for the United States, which is #1 for Australia, obviously. How do you link the situation in your region with the Middle East, and how and why is the Middle East important in that calculation?
That's an excellent question. All right, I'll start with the political first. In Australia, we do have a vibrant Arab and Muslim community. We also have a very vibrant Jewish community. We pride ourselves as being a multicultural country. In a world that is growing more and more warlike, it is becoming more difficult to keep the communities pacified, especially if they come from, you know, areas that are in conflict, especially in the Middle East. So that's problem number one. It's not really a problem, but it's an observation and something that I was listening to Raymond and I thought to myself, yeah, these interlinked connections are really important. From an Australian military perspective, if I just look at the military situation in the Middle East, look, it's an inescapable fact that Israel is one of the best armed forces in the world. And if you want to fight a war, you need to take a leaf out of Israel's books. You know, they've got a flattened command structure, their CNC is really good, their training is excellent. If we were all to prepare ourselves for the inevitable, it is a good model to base our collective defences on. So I think that if I was an Australian looking at the Indo-Pacific and I was in a command position, I'd probably send a few people off to Israel to find out how best to manage defence in depth.
Right, with one exception, right, on the 7th of October.
Well, yeah. Okay, you raised the 7th of October, and that's a fair call. Israel has a lot of really good technology. The one thing that puzzled me about Israel's response to it is that with all the technology at its disposal, it's using 2,000-pound bombs in a heavily built-up area, causing the very crisis that we are seeing internationally around our university campuses and all of this kind of thing. And I'm wondering, what is to be gained from that when there were other means by which Hamas could have been taken out? Technologically, training-wise, you know, I mean, it's not that Israel didn't have options, but Netanyahu decided to go a certain path, which is now assisted in turning international opinion away from Israel, which is a very peculiar situation for the Israeli state to suffer. Because up until this point in time, you know, they didn't have this problem. They could rely on international support. So.
Yeah, well, I think the component of technology is very important in the sort of discussion about modern warfare, because Hamas took a path to use only analog methods, no technology, and that is how they gained this advantage over reliant on technology Israel. They do not use cell phones, they only use paper, notes, face-to-face contact. That is also why it's so difficult to get an immediate response from the Hamas side, from Gaza, obviously. So, but that's another question. But so I sort of still fail to grasp if there is a linkage between Indo-Pacific and the Middle East. From the point of view.
All right. Okay, so if we look at many of the armed forces in the Middle East, they're all based on a Soviet model with Arab characteristics. And as we're seeing in the current war between Russia and Ukraine, you know, the way that the Soviets have a very strict top-down model is something that's been replicated all over the Middle East. And if we think that we're going to be fighting with China, much of China's entire military doctrine is coming out of the Soviet/Russian playbook. So when we see rockets and missiles firing across the skies of the Middle East, we can basically red team what that may look like in other scenarios. Does that make sense?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Omar, yeah, please comment on whatever you want to, but I also know that you've written a lot about terrorism and ISIS specifically. So, you know, what happened to terrorism? Like, where are the terrorists?
It's alive and kicking, but we'll come to that in a second. But just on the issue of Gaza, because it's very important on two dimensions. It shows how warfare transformed in one way, but also it may give us some hindsights for the future. So the Israeli army in June '67 defeated the Egyptian army while being outnumbered and outgunned just by the Egyptians, not to count the Syrians and the Jordanians, in about 35 hours. and took with 3 divisions,
Yes.
and took the entire Sinai Peninsula.
Yes.
The Israeli army today, the IDF had in December 2024 about 20 brigades, so a force with the size of about 6 divisions. In Gaza, 365 square kilometers, and 7 months into the fight, we're not finished. Yeah. And so it gives you an indication of how, and it's not just, well, Hamas did its homework. The 7th of October was a multi-domain, combined arms, offensive maneuver from the sea, air, and land, plus the electronic warfare dimension that they used as well, and also the intelligence information operation. So it was almost a minus space. It was the 6 domains were there, except for space. Space came later with the interception of exo-atmospheric ballistic missile that was sent from Yemen by the Houthis, also another sub-state actors. So all 7 domains of warfare were pretty much there, just to give you how war transformed and how difficult. But also they executed a very clever defense in depth, but it's underground defense in depth, because the subterranean dimension of the war was multi-leveled, and this gave them they doubled the size of Gaza, or tripled even the size of Gaza in a way, and also allowed the overground and underground lines of communication to remain. So the Israelis would clear an area, and after they withdraw from that area, they're thinking, okay, they cut all the ground lines of communications and the underground lines of communication, and then you have places like Beit Lahia and Beit Hanun in the very far north of Gaza, entered by the Israeli forces on 27th of October, so about 7 months before, and they're still fighting there.
Yes.
And still fighting on a squad, sometimes even to a platoon level. So sophisticated multi-level anti-tank ambushes, rocket firing. So also, relatively speaking, it's not just light squad level infantry. So this gives you, why I'm saying this, because the costs here, there was a famous foreign affairs article by Edward Lutwer called Give War a Chance. The costs here are tremendous for all sides. So the Israelis know that they cannot finish it in 35 hours like they did in June. Hamas, with the LER, loss exchange ratio, between them and the Israelis is about 1 to 25. So to kill 1 Israeli soldier is 25 from Hamas have to die. It's
How
enormous.
does it matter to us?
But they are mobilizing. So even with this very high attrition rate, they're still there in the fight. So with all this, these difficulties, and with the enormous human costs that we're seeing, over 35,000, and we don't know who's under the rubble. We'll still remove the rubble after this war ends and see what happens. With this enormous costs, I think everybody will have to think about before conducting a military operation. Yes. Okay. Sometimes, you know, the old saying of Sun Tzu, tactics without a strategy is the noise before defeat. This is wrong. You can actually have a series of tactics that will get you a favorable operational outcome without a strategy. ISIS, coming back to terrorism, was the star of that. They had no strategy. Their resources never matched their objectives. Always outnumbered, always outgunned, always changing their operational plans on the spot, like what happened in Mosul. And in the end, fighting 10-1 at least, they took the 2nd largest city in Iraq. While, with no air support, with no artillery support, with no air defenses, mainly technicals, soft-skinned, unarmored, and they managed to do it via very intensive IED warfare and maneuvers, which brings me to terrorism, as I said, alive and kicking. And if anyone interested in the details, they can read the last Security Council update it was published last February, on the state of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, especially in places like Afghanistan. Although the Taliban, funnily speaking, they're the counter-terrorist, counter-insurgents now, and they're actually doing some damage to ISPK, the Khorasan province of the Islamic State. But also in the Sahel, there's expansion, but they still maintain a brigade-sized formation in Iraq and on the borders of Iraq and Syria. So they're still there. But very, very, very briefly, there are 4 quick points. One, the tactical innovation and adaptations of these groups have been very much rising, especially the weaponization of civilian technology, including car bombs that turned an urban terrorism weapon into a battlefield weapon, a suicide vehicle born. These were the land domain of the sea babies and the Maguras in terms of the, but these are manned actually, not unmanned. So they actually, there's a driver, suicide bombers in it, and they had very much an impact. But also the military effectiveness of the non-state actors that has been also significantly on the rise, and how states are using this to their benefits, including Russia and including Iran, and how they're also mimicking some of these tactics and taking notes of these. And there's a long article also I wrote on how Putin's army fights like ISIS in Ukraine between 2014 and 2022.
Just one footnote question. So knowing so much about ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, what does their history tell you about the future of Hamas?
Well, they're copying from each other in many ways.
No, but will Hamas survive? Will Hamas survive?
I think it will reconstitute. So the damage has been done. It is degraded. ISIS was degraded significantly. It took about 5 years, from 2014 to 2019, until they took over the territory, and they're significantly degraded. But I think they will reconstitute. They will be able to reconstitute, even in Gaza.
Yep. Yeah, Raymond and John.
So, Patricia, if I may, I would not agree. I would say what we see, the performance of Hamas in Gaza, is a strategy. This is strategy. This is not tactics, TTPs, and technology. Iran has a strategy to destroy Israel, use Hamas as a proxy, and to destroy the Abraham dialogue. This is exactly strategy. So I'm agreed that Sun Tzu said tactics without a strategy is a way to nowhere or to destruction. But description, it's a key. The paradox is Poland is modernizing armed forces exactly in the way that we see the IDF. So we have the same F-35s, the same precision munition, we have the same long-range artillery, we're investing in a fence with the sensors. But the question is not about technology, it's about the strategy, understanding enemy, and using strong points and mitigate the weak points. So that's the point that I would say that the Iran has a pretty effective strategy how to at least mitigate or push the Israel to the corner. And Patricia, if I may, because we describe, the soldier's mind, sorry. We describe space as a chessboard physically about the region globally. But there's another factor very important, which is timeline. And if you see, again, the 3 points, China and Taiwan, Middle East, Iran, Israel, and Ukraine, Poland, Russia, say in the timeline, if, I would say, so Andrew, he's gonna kill me in a second, but I would say like the Washington perspective. If you really want to be effective in the competition, let's use the word competition with China, you have to solve the first problem, and the first problem is Russia. So losing, Ukraine politically, strategically, economically, any kind of dimension, we're losing credibility, and China is winning immediately. Israel right now is a destruction factor. It's unexpected, even in the chessboard. But I think that's the understanding the importance from Washington perspective. China will be #1. But I will motivate you and inspire a little bit that Russia is first, because without solving first objective, you will never be effective in the final one. So that's the important to understand the chessboard, like Brzezinski, he says, the great chessboard, not only in the physical dimension, but also in the timeline. That would be my observation.
Great. So I guess 2 fingers from John and Patty, if you want to. Okay,
just on the whole terrorism issue, I have supreme confidence that the IDF is going to make short work of Hamas at some point, taking into consideration everything you've said. But the outcome is pretty much secure. What I fear now, and here's the emotional part of my response, when you see the vision of the civilian carnage in Gaza, you are now seeing the next generation or 2 or 3 moving forward who are going to hate every Jew that they can see. The construct of Israel in their mind will be the construct of the enemy. And this is actually a strategic failure on behalf of Israel because, even yesterday when we were discussing European matters and the the idea that everyone here knows what the problem is. We can all articulate it, and yet somehow we can't filter that information up to our, our strategic political leadership. They don't want to know about it. In Israel, it's a sort of similar situation where, you've got a political elite run with a proportional representation system, which I hate because our Senate is based on that, and that's just rubbish. But anyway, the fact of the matter is that Netanyahu knows how to play that system very well. He's got his allies where he wants them to be. Everything is fine. Problem is, there has been absolutely no Israeli statesmanship in order to figure out what is going to be after the shooting. How do we bring the Palestinians away from the embrace of Hamas? How do we bring them away from the embrace of any sort of extremist behavior? They have completely shot themselves in the foot on that score alone. And this is where I think terrorism will actually become quite a problem. And it'll be, a resumption of Palestinian terrorism, probably on the likes that we saw during the 1970s, I would imagine. But
Patty?
And pulling from a piece of what you said in terms of the strategic fight, your fellow countryman and my friend Dave Kilcullen wrote a book called The Accidental Guerrilla, which was brilliant in explaining that indiscriminate use of force is always counterproductive in the strategic sense. So we're in that dilemma right now. But broadening it back out to this idea of what is winning, I feel there is a pretty good consensus in the room that we are in a global fight. We have values that we stand for that you pointed to: rule of law, free elections that are protected, open economies, individual rights. But our foreign policy needs to reflect all that to win strategically, to be believable, to discriminate ourselves against a Xi, a Putin, and the Iranian regime. So I think, just backing up a little bit, I'm not sure we're fully taking into account all the tools that Putin and this convenient alliance is using against us. Some of it's sort of coincidental, perhaps, or some of it is part of a backroom strategy. Supplying weapons to Russia demonstrates concretely that there is an alliance there. But I think that we have some work to do in truly understanding that Russian disinformation warfare is absolutely shifting the geopolitical space. I worked on information warfare, information operations for 9 years in the Pentagon in the early days, when we had no real thought that the U.S. population would be vulnerable to messaging that undermined its own government, our own Justice Department, our own intelligence community, and that we would have a president, I'm just going to be blunt, that would be the lead, take the lead in doing that. So I guess I'll leave it at that, but that is profoundly impactful, no matter what you think about the American politics, understanding that is the larger grand strategy that we're facing, primarily from Putin, but in this convenient alliance with others who benefit from the authoritarian model of government, winning and creating that new reality that new paradigm for global leadership that we're in danger of losing.
Yeah. I want to link what John said and what Patty just said about the stance of Russia in the Middle East and how that also connects with the situation in Europe and with Russian tactics to stir discord in European societies. So what has been for years puzzling to me is the good posture and stance in the minds of societies in the Middle East of Russia. Even though the first jihad, for the more fundamentalist Muslims, was against the Soviets in Afghanistan, and this is the invasion of 1979. So the first jihad in the modern era was against Russia. But still, what trumps this sentiment so much is anti-Americanism. And this links to what you said, John, that there are generations of Arabs, Muslims, and people in the sort of global south who were raised on the history of a series of American interventions. And this is 1991, the Desert Storm. This is 97, Desert Fox. This is 2001, Afghanistan. This is 2003, Iraq. And this is 2011, Libya. So this just tells you that, you know, there's such a vibrant anti-Americanism that Russia can now just, you know, swim in the splendor of the grace of this country in the Middle East. And it doesn't get this backlash that we are getting and the US is getting. So this really does matter. And what Russia does in Europe is they send 5 Bulgarians in Paris last week who sprayed red handprints on the Holocaust memorial, and these are most likely people sent by Russia, who came by train from Brussels to sow discord among the French society that someone just desecrated this Holocaust memorial. So it's incredible what's happening, and I don't think we are taking enough of a consideration for our politics, don't you think?
Yes, I actually, I'm sorry, I have to quickly jump in.
8 minutes, so yeah.
Yep. Look, I think that one of the things that I want to get off my chest, and that is, generally speaking, we lack statesmen or stateswomen or whatever you want to call them in the modern parlance. And what does that mean? It means being able to unite the military with the diplomatic. For many years now, those two zones are as separate as day and night. The military have their particular role to play. They do their thing. They're over there. The diplomats are over there. The diplomats can be sometimes a little anti-military, and I will say the military can be a little bit anti-diplomatic. But I think that statescraft, as it was once conducted in the West, demands that we be able to fuse those two things together and use them as a single force to push back. We haven't got that. And just to carry on with your point, which was excellent, yes, we let the Russians take a free kick to us whenever we like, because we're just not there. We're not able to push back at all. The interesting thing about the Iranian situation, if I'm being completely pragmatic and historical in my thinking, it's like Iran and Russia are not historic default friends. They're enemies. Who in Washington, Paris, London, or anywhere else is cobbling together a plan to cleave Iran off from Russia? Who?
Good point. We'll take 2 questions. I already see hands. All right, so I am so sorry, gentlemen, in the first row, but they were first. They were before you. So the lady over there, yes.
Hi, good morning. Katarzyna Sidor from Case Center for Social Economic Research.
We can't hear you.
Does it work?
Yeah.
Okay. Katarzyna Sidor from Case Center for Social Economic Research. Thank you so much for the excellent panel. I have a question about your opinion on the impact of the crisis, the Israel's wars on Gaza, on the economic strategy of Europe. And what I mean in particular is the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, which is seen by many as kind of a counter-strategy to the Belt and Road, so the Chinese impact in the region. Do you have any thoughts on that? Thank you.
Okay, let's take maybe 3 altogether. Since Andrew Mita was mentioned in the panel, he has to ask a question, and also one over there.
Council. So first of all, Raimund, I'm not going to kill you. I will actually ask you to keep staying on this message, because right now we're talking in Washington in terms of we just have half a box of crayons. That's why we were going to be painting on just half of the canvas, and that is asinine from the beginning. I have a question to John, because you said that what you see in the Middle East is actually showing what might be happening in the Indo-Pacific, what might be happening in other areas. There's a flip side to this. The Russians are also seeing this. The Chinese are seeing this. They're going to school on the weapon systems that NATO produces, procedures targeting, sensor to shooter, everything, which means that the system that Polish military, American military, anybody in NATO will be using, now we have to factor in that they'll be degraded in terms of their original capacity. So when you're looking at the effectiveness of those systems, it works both ways. The Russians are going to school, they're learning, they're jamming. We're now looking at C2 issues like we never had before. And my question is there a conversation within the alliance about, it takes two to tango and it works both ways? And the larger question is this. IDF, supposedly one of the best forces out there. The U.S. military, allegedly one of the best forces out there. We broke a lot of China in the Middle East and elsewhere. We achieved none of the strategic objectives. We have a culture of military power that is completely disconnected from temporal aspects of war, geography, culture. We're counting bullets and we're thinking that technology will solve it. In fact, technology is failing us. And the Russians are doing this the old-fashioned way. Everybody's laughing at them, but it's worked for them for 300 years, right? And they're 20 miles away from Vilnius. So my question is, what do we need to do, looking at Israeli failures, American failures, to actually start rethinking how we build our military power so that deterrence holds?
Just very brief question, Patrick. Like 2 sentences.
Okay. Thank you very much. Patrick Kugel, Pearson. I would like to link again this panel with the main focus of this conference and ask the panel about the impact of the war in Gaza Strait on the war in Ukraine. And I'm asking this question in the context of strategic communication, what Patricia said about the international law. When the war in aggression of Russia started in 2022, the West tried to present it as a war in fight in the protection of the rules-based international order. And after the last couple of months, I'm afraid this framing is not credible anymore. It's maybe trashed. It seems that we have many autocratic states that cares much more about the human rights of the civilian population in the Middle East.
I think we get it now.
Yeah.
Yes,
so,
I think so.
So do you think, is it a serious problem, or do we need a new framing for the war in Ukraine, and what can be done? What can be
or
done
a new
about
framing
it?
for the war in Israel, right? I mean, Gaza. We'll begin with you, Patty, if you agree. If you want to take any of these.
I think I'm okay.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to have to attack you. Well, not attack you, but handle that question. That's very complex, Andrew. But one thing that I would say is that we need, many years ago in the 1990s, we were formulating all these great, what do they call it, network-centric warfare fighting strategies. And that's great, utilizing technology in the best way possible to allow for a better outcome on the battlefield. My thinking would be extend that to unite your diplomatic with your military. Have one policy. It gives you policy coherence. And getting back to the strategic communication issue, comes down to strategic communication. Why is Russia winning? Because it has one simple message, and it keeps on hammering that simple message. What comes out of the West? The TikTok generation. Everyone's got a view. Everyone, wants to go out there and say whatever they have to say. Doesn't matter how uneducated it is. But that is the very chink in the armor for our strategic communication. We don't have a clear one message from any government.
Well, when we do, they immediately gets countered by some other nonsense that a lot of people, that it's a hot button and people start believing it, even without any expertise.
Absolutely.
So, Patricia, if I may, just one great example that was mentioned by Andrew is relation between instrumentarium and strategy. Let's take for a second one example. 1991, Desert Storm operation. What kind of instrumentarium we have? Abrams tanks, Bradleys, MLRS, Apache helicopters, F-15s, F-16s. And we are successful. More or less, George Bush, his idea, his strategy, how to solve the problem was successful. We have 2003, again in Iraq. We have the same tanks, the same Bradleys, the same MLRS, the same Apaches, F-16s, F-15s, and we are not successful. So that's the reason that...
There's one big difference.
Sorry?
The whole societies of the Middle East are in favor of the war in Iraq in 1991.
Strategy matters.
Whereas 2003, all are against.
So I wouldn't say the instrumentarium is the problem. It's a matter of idea, it's a matter of understanding enemy, understanding your region, relations, alliances, investments, timeline, and so on. So that's the point. And the gentleman asked about the relation between Gaza and Ukraine. There will be brutal description what I'm saying. But we have two biggest laboratories of war today, which is Gaza and Ukraine. So anything happen over there is absolutely future for using military instruments of power in a policy. So the question about relations, any single Iranian drone flying across, Iraq and going to Israel, and lessons learned taken immediately goes to Russia, because Russia used the same drones in Ukraine, and feeding, what the Houthis are doing and what's going on in Hamas. And it's exactly the situation what we observe in Ukraine. So this is no question. This is very simple for me. The question is how we gonna influence, cut off, or or change the things we see. It's a direct connection between Gaza and Ukraine.
Brilliant.
Just on the same,
last word.
In the same manner, it is interconnected. I think the Soviets saw it always as one theater from the Baltics to the Mediterranean, or Baltics to the Red Sea actually now, so with the Russian Federation. And that's a multi-front theater. And the fronts support each other when needed. So there's a classic example from December 2017 in the Donbass, where suddenly, after Minsk II, the firefights were reached at 1.40 per day, and then suddenly they're zero. And when were they zero? When Putin had a peace initiative for Syria. So it's de-escalating in the Donbass just to support so it's one theater with multi-front. And as for Gaza and Ukraine, there's lots of comparisons. Like, strategically, that's a part of it, because it was rumored that Putin has told the Hamas delegation that was a present for him, 7th of October, allegedly. And but more than that, there's an operational and tactical. There's a lot of notes taken. So whether it's the quadcopters dropping munitions, IEDs on Israeli points in the 7th of October, or how very effective are the old ways of having defensive lines inside the urban areas, subterranean and above above the ground, to either to undermine and atterrate the IDF in Gaza, or to undermine and atterrate the Ukrainian, Western-trained Ukrainian brigades in the south of Ukraine, the east of Ukraine. And other than that, there's quite a few others, including the idea of combined arms and multi-domain, horizontal escalation via sub-state actors. So if you're under pressure in Gaza, your sub-state actor can support you from Yemen, or from Iraq, and so on and so forth. And similar situation we have with the Wagner Group and others. So.
Thanks, Omar. Thank you, Patty, John, Raimund. I think it was a brilliant conversation.
Patricia, thank you very much for moderating this session. Can you come over, please?
Coming.
Yeah, I want to ask you a very broad question. Regarding our focus on developing a winning strategy, I'm wondering what it means to you, what it means to win in the context of the Middle East.
I'm not getting there. I think a big win, although I'm not sure if of global importance, would be some kind of an agreement between Palestinians and Israelis. And I also suppose that paradoxically, there's more chance for it now with the war raging there than it was just a year ago. So what I take from this panel, which I thought was really fascinating, are those clear links and linkages between what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in the Middle East. We really live in a global world, and this shows it.
Patricia, thank you very much for your insight. Thank you very much.